Imagine you're not in your cozy bedroom. You are in a tent. There's just a thin, embarrassingly fragile piece of nylon separating you from a forest full of animals that could end your life in a heartbeat if they wanted to. We're talking about lions, bears, wolves, and leopards. Creatures that can literally hear your heartbeat from across a clearing, smell you from a mile away, and see perfectly in the pitch black. Meanwhile, you're just lying there with your eyes closed. And yet, you wake up in the morning, every single time. Why is that? Seriously, think about it for a second. To a predator, a sleeping human is just slow, quiet meat that can't fight back or run. You'd think wild animals would circle campsites every night like an all-you-can-eat buffet, but they don't. Why do they leave us alone? The answer isn't just one thing. It's a beautiful, layered puzzle. Together, these pieces paint a picture of a strange, invisible agreement between humans and the wild. It's a bond that goes back further than our modern civilization, further than agriculture, and deep into our shared history. Let's look at why the dark looks at you and decides to pass you by. Chapter 1. The Invisible Monster. Let's start with a fact that sounds like a massive ego trip, but is actually just pure biology. To the rest of the animal kingdom, you are absolutely terrifying. Now, you specifically might feel normal and not scary at all. On paper, humans are kind of a disaster of an animal. We don't have claws, we aren't fast, we have terrible night vision, and we're not even that strong for our size. Yet, we carry an evolutionary aura of dread. To prove this, researchers at UC Santa Cruz conducted a fascinating study in 2019. They placed hidden audio speakers out in the California mountains where mountain lions, also known as pumas, live. When a puma approached, they didn't play the sounds of gunshots or traps. They just played normal recordings of human voices, people just talking. Do you know what happened? These absolute units of predatory efficiency, animals that can take down a full-grown deer with ease and drag it up a steep hill, heard a couple of people talking and fled. They ran away faster than they did from barking dogs. Even more heartbreakingly for the puma, they would abandon fresh food they had just killed. From a survival point of view, giving up a meal is a massive sacrifice. It means they burned calories for nothing. Yet the sheer discomfort of being near a human outweighed their hunger. This isn't unique in California. Across the globe, the story is the same. Lions in Africa's Kruger National Park actively avoid areas where humans walk. Tigers in India will give a wide berth to villages, even when those villages sit right in the middle of their favorite hunting grounds. Jaguars in the Amazon completely shift their travel paths just to avoid locking eyes with us. These apex predators haven't lost their strength. They have decided at a species level, over thousands of generations, that messing with us simply isn't worth the trouble. Chapter 2. The Memory in the Blood. Why are they so afraid? Because of a brutal historical truth. Humans have been the ultimate monsters of this planet for a very long time. For nearly 2 million years, our ancestors didn't just survive, they hunted. When humans arrived on new continents, the resident giants vanished. We hunted mammoths to extinction. We wiped out ancient megafauna, giant sloths, woolly rhinos, saber-toothed cats, and massive cave bears. In more recent history, we systematically trapped, shot, and poisoned wolves and mountain lions across North America until they were nearly gone. This creates a powerful engine for natural selection. The bold predators that walked into human camps got killed. The ones that kept their distance, the cautious ones that treated humans like walking danger, survived. They lived to have babies, and they passed that inherited caution down. So, when a leopard catches your scent in the night, it doesn't sit there consciously thinking about a history textbook. Instead, deep within its nervous system, a very ancient alarm goes off. It's a biological memory passed down from every ancestor that survived an encounter with us, whispering, "Step back, move on." Chapter 3. You smell wrong. Another reason you get a free pass at night is your scent. You probably don't think about how you smell because you're used to it. But to a predator, you are broadcasting a loud, incredibly bizarre chemical signal. Consider how sensitive their noses are. A bear's sense of smell is roughly 7 times stronger than a bloodhound's. Wolves can smell you from 2 miles away. Big cats have a special organ in the roof of their mouth called the Jacobson organ, which literally allows them to taste the air and analyze its chemistry. When they catch a whiff of a camping human, the data they get is just completely wrong. You smell like synthetic nylon tents and polyester sleeping bags. You smell like processed snacks, deodorant, minty toothpaste, sunscreen, and bug spray. This cocktail of artificial compounds exists nowhere else in nature. Beneath all of that, you smell like a primate. And a primate is not a deer, a wildebeest, or a rabbit. A predator's hunting instinct is not a generic switch that flips for anything made of meat. It is a finely tuned program calibrated to specific shapes, movements, and scents of traditional prey. Because you don't fit the template, you represent an anomaly. In the wild, anomalies trigger caution, not appetite. Chapter 4. The Ancient Magic of Fire. Think about the classic image of camping, sitting around a crackling campfire. We did something incredibly smart by mastering fire before we ever figured out farming, pottery, or writing. Fire is one of the very few things that triggers a universal instinctual fear across almost all land animals. It's an ancient code written into their DNA. Wild animals that ran from fire survived wildfires. Those that didn't perished. Even laboratory animals raised in cages who have never seen a spark will panic if they smell smoke. When humans tamed fire over 1 million years ago, we began sleeping next to it. A campfire does more than just keep us warm or cook food. It acts as a massive beacon in the dark that says something dangerous is here, something that commands the flames. Predators received that message long ago, and they still respect it today. Chapter 5. The Math of Survival. Hollywood loves to portray apex predators as fearless, unstoppable killing machines that attack anything that moves. But that is pure fiction. In reality, large predators are some of the most cautious, calculating creatures on Earth. Why? Because a wild animal doesn't have health insurance. A wolf doesn't get sick days. In the brutal reality of nature, a minor injury, a deep scratch, a chipped tooth, or a sprained leg can easily prevent an animal from hunting, leading to a slow death by starvation. Every time a predator looks at potential prey, it runs a risk-reward calculation. Is the energy I get from eating this worth the risk of it hurting me? Do I know how this creature fights back? A sleeping human fails this calculation completely. 1. Unpredictability. A lion knows exactly how a zebra panics and kicks. It has no idea what you will do. Will you scream? Do you have hidden tools? Will you thrash in a weird way? To a cautious predator, that uncertainty is a massive red flag. 2. Our silhouette. When humans stand up, we are tall and upright. Walking on 2 legs makes us look large and intimidating, much like a gorilla trying to look threatening. Even when we're lying down in a sleeping bag, our shape is unusual and assertive. 3. Easier options. If the local ecosystem is healthy, why would a predator risk its life tackling a bizarre, chemical-smelling mystery creature when there's a perfectly familiar deer or rabbit nearby? The math just doesn't add up. Chapter 6. The Guard That Never Sleeps. Here is a heartwarming truth about your own body. Even when you think you are completely dead to the world, a part of you is still looking out for you. Human sleep isn't a solid block of unconsciousness. We sleep in cycles, moving from deep sleep up into lighter stages like REM sleep, where our brains are highly active. Scientists call this the sentinel function of sleep.
During these lighter stages, your brain acts like a security guard filtering background noise. It ignores familiar sounds like the wind, but if a twig snaps loudly nearby, or if the heavy footsteps of a large animal disturb the brush, your brain flags it instantly. Our ancestors who slept too deeply were caught by the dangers of the night. The ones who slept a bit lighter, who could go from dead asleep to standing on their feet with a weapon in their hand within seconds, survived to pass their genes on to us. We actually sleep in lighter, shorter cycles than many other large mammals because our evolutionary history reminds us that the dark holds things worth waking up for. You are wearing a built-in early warning system. Furthermore, humans rarely camp truly alone. We gather in groups. Predators understand group dynamics perfectly because they see it in herds of prey. They don't want to attack a group. They look for the isolated, weak individual that wandered off. A campsite of humans is a collective unit. If one wakes up and sounds the alarm, the whole group wakes up. To a predator looking for a clean, low-risk meal, a chaotic group defense is a nightmare scenario.
Chapter 7. When the Rules Break. Now, to be completely honest, attacks do occasionally happen, but when they do, it's almost always because the natural order has been broken. The tragic historical accounts of man-eating predators usually feature animals pushed to absolute desperation. Take the famous lions of Tsavo in 1898, who terrorized a railway camp in Kenya. Records show these lions were facing exceptional circumstances. One of them had severe dental injuries that made it physically impossible to hunt its fast, natural prey. The same goes for the Champawat tiger, blamed for over 430 deaths in India and Nepal in the early 1900s. When she was finally stopped by the legendary hunter Jim Corbett, he discovered she had been shot in the jaw years prior, shattering her canine teeth. When an ecosystem is healthy, a normal, uninjured predator will almost never view a resting human as food. The danger only arises when injuries, starvation, habitat destruction, or humans leaving food out scramble their natural instincts and erase their inherited caution. Conclusion: the echo of our presence. There is one final mind-bending twist to this story. We have been so profoundly effective at making the wild afraid of us that our mere existence leaves a massive footprint on nature. That same UC Santa Cruz study discovered that when pumas run away from the sound of human voices, it creates a waterfall effect through the entire ecosystem. Because the pumas avoid human-heavy areas, the deer populations there explode. The deer then overgraze the plants and trees. Meanwhile, medium-sized predators like foxes and coyotes also steer clear of us, causing rodent populations to boom. Just by being there, our presence ripples through the entire living world. You are a member of the most influential species on the planet, the ones who tamed fire, who look out for one another in the dark, and who carry tens of thousands of generations of survival victories, beautifully written directly into their DNA. So, the next time you find yourself zipped up in a tent, deep in the wilderness, listening to the mysterious rustles of the forest outside, it's completely okay if you feel a little shiver of ancient anxiety. That feeling is just a gift from your ancestors keeping you alert. But you can rest easy. Close your eyes and take a deep breath. The thing outside in the dark, it knows better than to come in.